On a night when the world had turned to white noise and the wind made the trees whisper secrets into the dark, Mara Ren kept both hands steady on the wheel of her dented Subaru and counted the beats of the windshield wipers as if their metronome could steady her heart, a rhythm she had learned to trust through 4 winters in the Northeast Kingdom when the roads iced over and the maples leaned like old men, and her 6-year-old son Eli, in his puffed blue jacket and knit hat with a crooked palm, pressed his mittened hand to the window and asked in that clear bell of a voice, "Mommy, why is he alone in the snow?" And the words cut through the quiet like a flare, because out there on the shoulder of Route 105, under a sky flayed open by moonlight and cloud, a man was standing or trying to stand in a drift that swallowed his knees, his silhouette carved in sharp edges by the white glow, one arm wrapped around himself and the other hanging, useless, like a strand of shadow too heavy to lift, and his head was bare, his dark hair iced and bristling, and in the second that Mara let herself look, she saw the way his shoulders tilted as if his whole body was a ship trying not to capsize, the way he blinked toward the roar of their tires and flinched like an animal. "Maybe he's waiting for someone," Mara answered before she meant to, because the words came with the heat of a reflex, the sort that had learned to smother all questions with safer answers since Eli was born and since Mac, Eli's father, Mac who had laughed in storms, was gone, and the rest of the road ran like a pale ribbon ahead, but that ribbon led only to their cabin where the kettle would boil over the wood stove and the generator would chug, and it would be just the two of them, safe and small inside the circle of light they could make, and it would be easy to keep going, to press the gas and pretend the snow could swallow one more stranger, except Eli was still looking, and it was not just curiosity, Mara realized, not the kind that made him ask why the snowflakes were different from one another or why the stars looked closer on cold nights. It was something she'd seen when he held out a mitten to the neighbor's shivering barn cat, when he knocked on the rough wood of old Mr. Lutz's door and asked if he needed help bringing in wood last December, an instinct that came from someplace that hadn't yet calcified into fear, and Mara felt the stupid, human ache of that inside her and eased her foot off the gas, because if she drove on there would be no getting the image out of her mind. The man turned away so slowly, as if even the air was a weight to be lifted, and so she checked her mirror for oncoming lights. There were none of, and tapped the brakes, the Subaru yawing a little in the powder before it came to a slanted stop, humming like a living thing. "Stay buckled," she said, because that was what mothers said, and because she had learned that the world would try to take any slack you gave it, and she pulled her scarf up over her face and opened the door into the slap of wind, the cold hitting her like glass, the shards in her lungs sharp and bright, and the snow came like needles, like soft needles, like a million soft needles she had to walk through and not show pain. "Hey," she called, lifting a hand in her thin knit glove, which she immediately wished was something better, and the man's head turned toward the sound, his eyes unfocused and rimmed with frost, blue or gray or the kind of color that changed with weather, and up close she saw the delicate white spray of ice in his beard and the ragged line of a cut on his cheek, already turning waxy from the cold, and he was not an old man or even middle-aged but somewhere near her own age, 32, maybe 35, with the sort of face that could have been on a billboard or a wanted poster depending on the tilt of his mouth, his breath coming shallow and fast. "You lost?" Mara asked, hearing how absurd the question was, because everyone was lost out here in the storm, and his lips parted as if words were a thing that might break if he touched them too harshly, and he managed, "Car, battery died, walked," each syllable like he'd waited for it through heavy water, and Mara moved closer, her boots sinking, her thick coat flapping, and reached for his arm, which was hard under the soaked wool and too cold and oddly light, like he weighed less than he should. "Come on," she said, a command gentled into a plea. "We're 10 minutes from my place, there's a stove, you can warm up," and the man hesitated as if he understood the line she was stepping over, as if he might spare her the consequences of her own kindness, and he shook his head a fraction, a negative that looked like a flinch, and hummed, "Don't no trouble," in a voice that had been pleasant once and was now frayed at the edges. "We'll make it quick, then you can call whoever you want," Mara said, because it was easier to promise a future than to untangle the present, and she hooked his arm over her shoulder and walked him back to the car as Eli craned his neck and called through the little crack in the glass where he'd lowered the window in defiance of every winter rule she had ever taught him. "Hi, I'm Eli," his small voice bright with the bravery of a 6-year-old who believed names made you safer, and the man's mouth twitched at the corner the faintest of smiles and he bobbed his head. He began in a reflex that seemed to spring from the center of his chest before he swallowed the syllable and tried again. "Evan," he said like he was sampling the shape of it for the first time, tasting its newness and finding it acceptable, and if Mara had been paying attention to the shiver that ran through his voice in that one syllable, she might have known then that he was lying, but she was thinking of professional, practical things, the way you loop a belt around someone whose ankle might be broken, the way you keep their head at your shoulder, the way you ease a tall man into the passenger seat of a small car and let his long legs find whatever space they can find, and because she was thinking of this she didn't clock the watch under his cuff, the shine of a dial that had its own private gravity, or the fabric of his coat that did not belong on the shoulder of a Vermont road, tailored and terrible for weather like this, and she got him in and shoved the door. And the car smelled instantly of cold and wet wool and something faintly mineral blood, probably, and Eli wiggled in his booster but stayed buckled like she'd told him, and he stared at the stranger with candid, unabashed curiosity. "Nice to meet you, Evan," Eli chirped, and the man breathed out a laugh that fogged. "Nice to meet you, Eli," he said, and his voice softened around the name, and then the road, the pale ribbon, was theirs again, and Mara eased the Subaru into it and drove with her tongue pressed to the roof of her mouth, a habit she'd picked up when she needed to feel the precise shape of the next word in her mouth before she committed to saying it, and she said nothing because she'd learned how silence could be a blanket, because she'd been silent the night the paramedic had told her in a voice that tried not to break that they had done all they could and the words had had no place to go in her and so they hid in corners and waited, and when she'd come home she'd had to learn to fold blankets again, to keep Eli's toys in their bins, to make food with her hands even when her body did not want to be a body that made anything anymore. She had learned to do what needed to be done, and now what needed to be done was to get this man to the cabin, to wrap him in dry blankets and put a cup of sweet tea between his hands, and to ignore as best she could how every once in a while he stiffened and shot a glance at the mirror as if the night was another car suspended just behind them, and she couldn't help herself and asked, "So, where were you headed?" And he said, after a second, "North," like the direction itself could be a destination, and when she waited for more, the wipers rose and fell and rose and fell and the dome light glowed a bronze coin in the rear view where Eli blinked solemnly and drew little roads with his finger on the fogged glass, and even without more Mara could see the rest in the way he held himself, the energy a certain kind of city man carried like a shirt you couldn't shake off, the way his hands, even blue with cold, had the steadiness of someone who made decisions quickly, the kind that didn't always give you time to check if they were the right ones, and before she knew it the road softened into the driveway between firs that were all shoulders now under their heavy coats of snow, and the cabin appeared like a dark square cut out of the night, a soft orange bloom above the curtained windows and a thread of smoke teaching the dark how to move, and Mara pulled the car near the porch and turned off the engine and the night flooded in, the silence that lived under snow thundering in her ears, and she let herself not think for 1 second before she moved, the way she had not thought the night Eli was born and she'd grabbed the bag and gone, and she opened the passenger door and helped him out and felt the way his body leaned and worried that he'd fall and felt him do the calculus and decide not to, and the old Boards of the porch complained under 3 sets of footsteps, and the key went in the lock and the latch slipped, and the smell of the place pine and apple peel and the metallic tang of the stove reached out to meet them, and it felt like a movie would feel if the scene opened with a pan across a tabletop crowded with chipped mugs and a jar of marbles and a vase of cedar sprigs, the camera landing on a puddle of light where a loaf of bread cooling in its tin threw the smallest curl of steam into the air, and the fire in the stove clicked as it adjusted to the open door. "Boots," Mara said by reflex to Eli, and he hopped and wrestled, tumbling snow across the mat with a laugh, and she put a shoulder under the stranger's shoulder again and guided him to the sagging couch, and if there had been music it would have been strings, something taut and hopeful, and if this had been one of those thrillers she watched late at night with a bowl of oatmeal in one hand and her own hand clamped over her heart, this is where the man would have reached into his jacket and pulled a gun, or this is where the camera would have cut to a black car creeping down a road blown in with snow, headlights like twin augers. But in her kitchen the kettle began to rumble on the stove because 10 minutes before she had left she had filled it for tea and then changed her mind because Eli had said he wanted hot chocolate and she'd let the idea of sweetness puncture the gray. She slid blankets over the man's shoulders and he flinched again, but less, and the cut on his cheek was already beginning to ooze with the warmth, making a ruddy smear, and she wet a clean washcloth in warm water and wrung it out and pressed it gently to the cut and watched his eyes solve her face, his gaze wet glass behind which something moved slow and soft. "Thank you," he said, and it was almost nothing but it hit her anyway, the way gratitude always did when it was raw and honest and exactly the right size for the person who offered it. "You can thaw here," she said, moving back to the stove, "the motion's easy, spoon, cocoa, sugar, hot milk into a bowl Eli couldn't break," and when she turned with the mug of tea she saw that the man's hands were shaking as they reached for it, not the fine tremor of cold, but something deeper, the aftershock of adrenaline, and she thought of the way he had flinched at the mirror and tucked the thought into a corner to deal with later. "Mommy, why is he alone in the snow?" Eli asked again, because children are the best kind of persistent, and the man looked at the boy and then at the tea, and then at Mara, and she framed her answer with care because she understood that sometimes the way you put words around something decides what shape it'll take when it breathes, because sometimes grown ups get lost, too, she said, and it's hard to ask for help, and at that the man's mouth did that almost smile again, but this time it broke into something larger, quickly. "Hidden under the rim of the cup, it was my own dumb choice," he said, and then sucked in the tea too quickly, burning himself, and there was something so ordinary in that human mistake that she laughed and then he laughed too, and the sound was not desperate, was not wary, was just a sound two people who were tired made when they'd lost a joke and then found it again, and Eli said to no one and everyone, "I'm going to draw him," and went to the little table with the crayons and pulled a sheet from the stack and began with 2 eyes and a circle and a hat because all men who didn't wear hats should wear hats when it was snowing, and the snow fell, and the room warmed, and the stranger's skin flushed pink again, and his hair thawed and fell in damp curls at his temple, and if there had been a narrator perched on the beam above the stove, she might have used this as the moment to tell you that this man, who said his name was Evan, had not walked north tonight by accident, that the road he'd chosen to get lost on bent not 3 miles east of the old Denby place, which a woman with her hair in a braid had once owned and had once sat on the porch of sipping coffee with her son, who would grow up to take the world's hands and move them as if they were something you could set to your own tempo, a boy who had learned, quietly at first, that money could be a kind of insulation and had then learned that insulation could make the sound of your own breath so loud in your ears that you didn't notice you were drowning. But there was no narrator and there was no beam, there was only Mara, who had made soup because every problem felt smaller when cut vegetables met hot stock, and she ladled bowls and handed one to the stranger, who took it like it was the first time someone had handed him something without asking him for something in return. "I can pay you," he said suddenly, sharply, as if paying was a lever that would set everything right again, and Mara tilted her head and looked at him like a bird. "We don't do tallies around here that way," she said, and he nodded as if filing that away under a, for anomalies. "Still," he said, and then he stopped because he reached up to push his hair back and his sleeve slid back, and in that movement the slick dark of it caught the light and flung it back with a sort of opinion, a watch that was not owned by the kind of man who stood on Vermont roads in snowstorms, and Mara felt for her glasses on the mantel and put them on so she could look closer, and before she could tell herself not to, her mind flipped through the mental Rolodex of things that had made their way to her even in the quiet of This Place magazine covers in Mr. Lutz's kitchen when she had left soup, the scrolling headlines on the ancient tablet that Doc Pritchard had in his waiting room, names that had become weather patterns, a man whose company had promised to make the world both faster and kinder and had ended up doing what such promises always did, which was break in complicated shapes. The watch looked like it belonged in a photograph of a plane and a smile, not in her living room, and she tried to look away and failed. The man saw her seeing him and set the mug down too carefully. "Thank you for the soup," he said, and made the sentence into an answer to a different question, and something like shame, or an older cousin of shame that looked like regret, moved across his face, slow as a cloud, and he reached into his pocket and froze and then pulled back empty, as if he'd remembered that the thing he was about to do might change the way the air moved in the room. "Do you want to use the phone?" Mara said, hearing the way her voice thinned over the words, and he blinked as if she had waved a hand in front of his eyes. "Yes," he said, "if you don't mind," and he sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and she nodded and stepped into the small hall and took the old landline from its cradle, the one that still worked when the power flickered, because she had learned not to trust anything that failed her when the wind blew the trees just so, and she brought it back and put it on the coffee table. The man looked at it like one might look at an old photograph, touched a finger to the coiled cord, and then dialed, hands steady now, and he put the phone to his ear, and Mara could hear, faintly, the low burble of a voice, and the man said, "Declan," and something in his voice changed, untightened, rearranged the way you switch languages when you move from work to a person who knew you before the world did, and then he said, "I'm fine," which was a lie, and, "I don't want them anywhere near this zip code," and the "we" in the "them" hung in the air like fog, and then, "Tell Melissa we're going to do this another way," and he flicked a glance at Mara, which was a sort of apology and a sort of test, and she notched her chin toward the kitchen as if to say goodbye to his secrets for the moment, as if to give them privacy, because she was not born in a barn and because privacy sometimes was the only thing that felt like dignity. She took Eli's homework folder from his backpack and set 3 little math problems in front of him, and they stood like stones, simple and sure, and he tapped his pencil against his lip and frowned in a precise, practiced way, and Mara felt her own face move in sympathy and then went to stir the soup so she had something to do with her hands. The storm set itself to work outside, which is to say it stopped being dramatic about it. The flakes fell in that thick, purposeful way that meant business, and the wind harrowed the eaves and the trees creaked, and the cabin held, which is what cabins did, not because they were made of any magic material but because things that were cared for tended to remember how to be the thing they were. "Mom," Eli said, "does soup count as dinner if it's also lunch?" And she said, "Soup is timeless, kid," and she turned back toward the living room with 2 mugs of cocoa balanced on a tray and saw, in that bubble of time that exists when the air in a room changes, the way the man Evan, who had almost been sat very still, phone held loosely now, as if it had told him something and he wasn't ready to hold it tight, and he said, when he noticed her, "Sorry, work," with the sort of laugh that men used when they wanted to make the word a joke for your sake even if it wasn't funny, and she nodded and handed him the cocoa and their fingers almost touched and he flinched again, but not from her this time, and she turned and put the tray on the table. And the thing about storms is that they can make you feel like the world has retreated to the size of your kitchen, that everything that could hurt you has to knock first, and so the knock when it came was louder than it had to be, not a hesitant rap, but a battering thud that rattled the wooden spoon in the crock and made Eli stare at the door like it had grown teeth. Mara's heart pitched hard, and then steadied, because fear was a wave she had learned to let pass through her. Expecting someone, she asked the man without looking at him, and she watched in the reflection in the window as he put the mug down and closed his eyes and cursed without sound. "No," he said aloud, and under the word was something like grief. The knock came again. The polite fiction of it slipping, and a voice slid along the crack under the frame. Mara ran. It called, not a neighbor's voice, not the sheriff's, and Mara's mind flipped through the small file of men who might know her name on the wind and came up empty. "Who are you?" she asked, and she wanted to reach for the rifle on the pegs by the back door, but it would never make it to her hands without being obvious. So she placed a palm on Eli's head instead, so gently, as if making sure he was real. "Wardens," the voice said, too quickly, and Eli peered up at her and she put a finger to his lips, and the man Evan slid silently to the narrow door off the living room that led down to the little root cellar, as if he knew the architecture of old houses in his bones. And she realized she was not the only one here with a map of how to make herself smaller. He paused at the door and looked at her, a question, and she answered it with a tiny, stern nod, and he improved the plan by tilting his head toward Eli as if to ask if the boy, and she held up a hand, "No," and then he was gone, finishing the sentence of a breath like a vanishing act. "Wardens," Mara said, pitching her voice into the kind of unimpressed that any local could be when encountering an outsider who'd decided this was the tone to use. "We didn't call," she said, and the voice outside lower now, an approximation of reasonable said, "We're doing a sweep, the storm's got folks stranded, thought we'd check," and she pictured them because they were more than one. She could hear the shifting in the snow, a kind of weight you can't fake, their jackets with patches you could buy online, their boots too new, the way the wind tried to shove their words into her house, and she stepped 2 feet sideways and picked her phone off the counter, because sometimes a bluff was the bodyguard you needed, and she said, loudly, "Sheriff Gall? It's Mara. I've got a couple of unknowns knocking, and they say they're wardens," and she held the silent phone to her ear and made it a prop, and outside someone shifted and the silence between her words traveled outward and thinned. There was a long minute and then a knock that tried to be small and didn't manage it. "Mara," the voice said, "we've got reports of a man on foot, we want to make sure no one's in need," and she could hear behind the pretense the hum of something else, the fast talk people use when they want to keep the thread moving so you don't notice where it's leading. "We're all right," she said, measuring each syllable and finding it held, and she imagined Sheriff Gall's big hand on her shoulder later if she was wrong, and she pictured him rolling his eyes at her anyway because he would have done the same. Outside boots crunched and then receded and then there was only wind, and the room's air changed back to family-sized, and Eli exhaled loudly because he was old enough to try to be brave and young enough to forget to do it quietly. The door to the root cellar eased open and Evan reappeared, ghost white from the angle. "Sorry," he said in a breath without air, "they're not here to help," and she said, "I figured," because it was easier to say she had known all the time. "You know them," she added, and he grimaced and for a second it made him look too young, like a boy who'd found out a rumor was about him and wasn't entirely untrue. "Some of them," he said. "Or the kind of men who work for the kind of men who work for me." "Worked," he corrected, and then, "I should leave." I'm sorry, and he stood, a decision done, and Mara put a hand on his arm, and go where, she asked, and he looked at her and then at Eli, and that was when, for the first time, she saw fear that had nothing to do with cold inside him, real and raw, and it surprised her, because men like him, yes, she was thinking that now, men with watches like that and phones that could ring a lawyer in the dead center of a snowstorm and bring him to his door didn't show fear, not that kind. The barn, he said, I'll get out when it's light, and then he added, too quickly, I don't want to drag you into something you didn't sign up for, and it sounded like a line he'd had to say too many times, and her anger came like a small flame that flared and then steadied, because who had asked her to sign up for waking in the deep night alone? Who had asked her to sign up for solving 100 small problems before breakfast without anyone to say good job? The world did not require signatures for most of its contracts, and she looked at him and said, we don't leave people alone in storms, and then she heard the edge in her voice and softened it for the child, whose eyes were wide, but we do this my way, she said, and he laughed a little and nodded, and then, because the world does what it does whether you're ready or not, the generator hiccuped and died, with that final cough that makes you believe in personality, and the lights went out and the cabin folded itself in around the dark like a cat curling, and then the stove's orange window remained the only light and everything outside expanded, the storm pressing itself close, the windows becoming membranes between inside and wind. They lit the oil lamps and the cabin transformed into a photograph older than it was, the gold light filming everything with a kind of softness that made even the nailed boards look framed and chosen. Eli, who had seen blackouts before, reached for the drawer with the deck of cards without being told and set them on the table like a talisman. War, he said hopefully, and Mara opened her mouth to say later and then closed it again because there was no later to promise a child this way, and she sat and let him deal heavy, sloppy stacks, and the ritual of it calmed the air, and the man Evan stood near the window with his head tilted, listening not to them but to the way the storm moved around the house, and he said, after a minute, they'll be back, and Mara nodded and said, let them, and then, swallowing the hard taste of fear, added, you know my name, and he said, surprising her again by choosing not to lie, they said it, and she felt the room tilt because that meant one of the men had known who lived in this house before he had knocked, had chosen to call her by name like a neighbor, and it was suddenly important to her to drill down into the reality under the floating abstraction of this man's story. Who are you? She asked finally, and he smiled in that small, tired way that tells you a truth is coming, because it's the only thing left, and said, do you really want to know? And she said, yes, or I can keep calling you Evan, and he nodded, as if her choosing had consequences he would live with, and he looked at Eli, who had paused in the exact posture of a child who understands that adults are doing something serious and is both drawn to it and uninvited, and then he looked at Mara and said, my name is Adrian, and he waited. Adrian, she repeated, the name a stone you turn over in your hand, and he added, hail, which was a word like a door opening, and if she had been a different woman she would have dropped the lamp or clutched her throat or whispered oh my God like a prayer or a curse, but instead she blinked twice and nodded once because names were always just keys until you put them in locks, and she said, very evenly, the one who disappeared, and he said, just as evenly, apparently, and for a moment he looked like a man who had stepped outside his own house and realized he could not find the door again. They said you took a jet to Iceland, Mara said, which was what the headline had said on Doc Pritchard's tablet 2 mornings ago before the storm had eaten the roads and the town had focused on salt and shovels rather than narrative, and Adrian, it felt strange to think the name, tilted his head and said, they would, and he did not laugh. They, she said, not entirely sure if she was asking a question or making a category, and he obliged either way, people who profit from me being somewhere else, he said, and it sounded almost gentle, and she realized that gentleness was the way he had learned to carry his anger, because he could not afford to drop it on people and because if he set it down it would run away from him. "Why are you here?" Eli asked, and the man looked at the boy and his whole face changed, the muscles near his mouth unhooking as if something that had been braced for years had relaxed one notch. "Because I needed to think," he said, and then added, "and because I was told not to," and Mara's laugh came out in a puff, involuntary, because she had learned the hard way that sometimes your best decisions are the ones you are forbidden to even consider. The storm hammered the roof with the flat palm of this, and in the deep part of the night when all rooms drop an inch lower and time folds, the men came back, this time in silence, which is a kind of sound if you know how to hear it, and Adrian heard it first. He was on the floor by the hearth where he'd settled like an animal that had found a warm spot, and he lifted his head before the first boot touched the porch boards, and Mara saw him already in motion, all that city training, all those years of escaping through different kinds of rooms telling his body there were only so many ways a thing could play out, and he moved toward the root cellar again, and this time Mara whispered, "Not there, because the first place you hide is the first place they will look," and she gestured to the back hall where a narrow door led to the crawl space under the pantry, accessible only through a panel so stiff you had to know its trick, and Adrian took Eli's hand on the way past because there are some habits you develop before you notice you developed them. And then they were in the hall and Mara's fingers found the right groove and the panel finally gave and Adrian folded himself like rope into the darkness, his breath warm for a second on the sleeve of her coat, and then the knock capitulating now to the idea of a knock as theater came and Mara let her face smooth into the expression she had learned the day she lost her husband and had to stand in a kitchen while the rest of the world kept making toast, that face that said, "I will not splinter for you," and she opened the door. 3 men stood on the porch this time, built from the same box, big shoulders, expensive cold weather gear that looked more like clothing for being seen in than for surviving in, and the one in front had a paper in his hand, which is what you hold if you want to make something look official. "Miss Wren," he said, with a smile Roots couldn't find purchase in, "we're looking for a missing person," and he glanced around her, infuriating, unafraid, confident that the world would conform to his need, and she remembered the nights in the diner when she had worked 2 shifts back to back and men like him had looked past her even as she poured their coffee. "The only missing persons around here are tourists who think trail markers are decoration," she said, and the man's smile dimmed a shade. "The stakes are higher than that," he said smoothly, and he held the paper out as if to show her the stakes, and she took it because it is a powerful thing to take a man's anchor in your hand, and she looked and saw a photo printed from the internet, a face framed by a headline whose text bled at the edges from too many low ink presses. "He's armed and dangerous," the man said, and she did not glance at the pegs by the door where the rifle hung, because the only thing more dangerous than a liar confident in his lies is someone who shows him how to make them easier. "We're asking you to call if you see him," he added, and she said, "What do I get if I do?" To see what he thought she valued, and his smile came back, quick, like a coin flip. "Safe," he said, and she stepped back a half step to keep the sound of Eli's breath from being heard in the hall, and she said, "I'm safer when my door is closed," and she started to close it, and the man put his boot in the jamb and said, "We have reason to believe he's already been seen in this area," and she thought of the road, of how men like him expected women like her to give them the information they wanted if they used the right tones, if they made their eyebrows lift just so, and her anger steadied her hand. "So look," she said, "and don't knock down my door on your way out," and then, because she understood the choreography of escalation, she added, "You touch this door without a warrant, Sheriff Gall will make the storm outside look like a walk, and she said his name like a conjuring and watched them do the math, watched their glance flick sideways as if to check the world hadn't changed and made her right where they weren't looking, and after a long and funny second, they took their proper menacing leave and slid back into the storm, and Mara stood with her hand on the door and felt the weight of the house shift back to her. In the crawl space, Adrian counted the minutes and then the fives of minutes and then the threes of them, and then he climbed out with sawdust in his hair and the expression of someone who wanted to apologize and knew it wouldn't be enough. "They'll try again," he said. "I know," she said. "Then I should go," he said. "Not in this," she said, and nodded toward the windows where the storm had settled its big, heavy body against the glass, and he looked at her like a man who had to understand the physics of a decision before he could make it, and then sat slowly back down by the stove. "They said you had a gun," Eli said from the table where he had arranged his animal crackers into a story with no clear plot, and Adrian's face tilted, and he said, "I don't," and Eli looked at his mother to see if that was the answer she expected too, and she gave him a little nod that said it would do. "Never liked them," Adrian added, half to himself and half to the boy, "too loud," as if the decibel level was the most important thing about how you solve fear, and Eli held up a cracker shaped like a lion and said solemnly, "This one is loud," and Mara felt something in her chest knit itself in a new way. That night, Patience lived in the spaces between minutes, and the storm did the thing storms sometimes do when they sense that a plot is unfolding. It pressed itself against the walls and made the rest of the world look like it had nothing whatsoever to do with this. Mara found the extra quilts and threw them like new laws across the couch, and Adrian took them with a gratitude he did not try to hide, and Eli insisted on telling a bedtime story in which the hero was a boy who left a bread trail and then had to eat it because he got hungry, and Adrian listened with the kind of attention that makes children taller and said nothing when the boy pronounced in the end that the moral was to always carry more snacks than you think you'll need, and when Eli was finally tucked in with his stuffed rabbit and the wind sighed under the eaves in a way that sounded like a conversation between old friends, Adrian put his elbows on his knees and said, very quietly, "Thank you, again, you already said that," she said, but the words came out like a smile. "I know," he said, "I keep needing to," and he looked at his hands, which had a small cut at the base of the thumb, and it looked like the place where his lifeline would be if you believed in that sort of thing. "Why were they calling you dangerous?" she asked, and he breathed out like a laugh run out of air. "Because it's easier to say that than to say I'm inconvenient," he said, and then he looked at her and said, "I signed a deal I shouldn't have signed, and then I tried to pull the company out of it, and there are people who think I should sit down and look pretty and let them cash checks," and she thought of the times she had signed her name where she didn't know what the paper would ask of her, hospital forms and school forms and documents with dense blocks of words and then a line sign here like a river crossing a field. "You could have stayed in your tower," she said, and he laughed for real then, a short, unflattering sound. "I don't have a tower," he said, and then had the grace to add, "not the kind that matters," and the lamp made a small halo over his head that he'd have hated if someone told him about, and the conversation dipped and swelled and eventually the words thinned out into the breath of sleeping people in a warm room, which is one of the oldest, most reliable songs the world still sings. Morning came gray and flat, and the storm, satisfied with its performance, became less dramatic and more inevitable, the sky a low lid, the trees hooded in ice, the drifts rimmed with a jagged edge where the wind had worried at them. Mara woke to the sound of someone splitting wood, a deep crack-lift-crack rhythm she hadn't heard since before Mac died, because she had never found the feel of the axe honest in her hands, and she slid into boots and opened the back door, and there in the sugar Maple's small square was Adrian, coatless idiot, breath streaming, his shoulders moving with the controlled aggression of someone who had found an old, crude solution to a modern problem and was trying it on for size. He saw her and grinned in a way she hadn't seen yet, unguarded and bright, and she realized with a jolt that he was handsome, and the realization embarrassed her in the way of a private joke told in the wrong room. "You didn't have to," she said over the chuff of the cold, and he shrugged. "I wanted to," he said. Simple, and people who say things simply are either telling the truth or lying as a practice you can't root out, and she chose, because you always choose, to believe the former. "Breakfast?" she asked, and he nodded and followed her in, and the kitchen had the warmth of a place in which bread had risen and things had been mended and children had learned to pour milk without spilling it, and he looked around like he had stepped into a country he had always been told was myth, and he said, "I had a kitchen once," and the past tense made its own weather around the word. "What happened?" she asked, not because it was her business but because kindness sometimes is a shield you need to offer someone by making their sadness small enough to carry in a sentence, and he said, "I stopped going home," and she did not ask why, because she already knew one answer and because that was enough. Over pancakes, Eli's favorite for storms because they tasted like morning. Even when it was afternoon they made a list, because Mara had lived long enough to know that lists are spells, and the list was simple: check the road, check the barn, check the cellar, keep the lights down after dark. "Will your men come?" she asked, meaning the kind of men who would stand between him and the other men, and he said, "If they don't, I'll fire them," and she snorted into her coffee and he said, "I deserve that," and then the phone rang, the little bell jangling old-fashioned and sincere, and Mara picked it up and said, "Renz," entirely by reflex, the way her grandmother would have answered a decade ago when everyone in the county knew everyone else's ring, and Sheriff Gall's voice came over the line like a hand as big as his chest. "Mara," he said, "you got any strangers up there?" And she hesitated because the sheriff had been to Mac's funeral and had taught Eli to bait a hook, but he also wore a badge that put his whole body on the wrong side of private, and she said, "We always got strangers, it's called a highway in a blizzard," and he grunted, which could have been a laugh if it were summer. "Keep the doors barred," he said, "we got folks sniffing who won't tell me why they're sniffing," and she said, "Copy," and he said, "You're a good woman, Mara," and she said, because the word good always made her itch, "I'm an adequate mother in a storm," and he smiled where she couldn't see him and rang off. "He'll help," she said, hanging up, and Adrian said, "I will too," and she believed him, because he said it like a promise that had his own skin in it. By noon the road hadn't appeared again and the men did, on loud snowmobiles that made the pines shiver and spat 2 flags of powder up behind them as if their speed made them invincible, and they cut their engines 20 yards from the house and the quiet that followed felt like a predator drawing breath. Inside, Mara gathered what could be gathered quickly: a small backpack with snacks, Eli's favorite rabbit, a thermos, a first aid kit, because you learn to keep certain things close when the world reveals its preferences, and she looked at Adrian and then at the back door. "If they come in," she said out loud, because saying it makes it manageable, "we go out," and he nodded and she handed him a pair of Mac's boots, big and old and cracked and beautiful in the way of things that refuse to go even when they are no longer stylish, and Adrian jammed his feet in without a wince because discomfort was not his top concern, and they went at once because the plan would not grow better the longer they considered it. The yard was a smear of light and shadow, blown over by the last good wind, and the woods beyond it a crouched silence, and Mara led, because it was her terrain, and Adrian followed, because he understood command even when it came from a temporary general, and they angled down into the gully where the old sled path ducked between birches and disappeared into the deeper woods, and the idea was to stop being seen without stopping moving, and it worked until it didn't. Until one of the men, maybe smarter than the rest, or maybe just luckier that day, came around the house and saw the flash of Eli's hat, the orange that was always supposed to make hunters not shoot at animals they shouldn't, and now marked a child in the snow like a pulled thread. "Hey," the man shouted, and the word slammed into the white and the white threw it back, and they ran, which is not what you are supposed to do in snow but is exactly what a body does when fear opens the door. The woods caught them and swallowed them for 3 breaths and then spit them out at the creek, which in normal winters held and in freak ones lay under a skin of ice as thin as a promise, and Mara skidded and caught Eli and looked at the place where the ice would likely hold and then at Adrian, and in that split second the men came into view, dark shapes against light, their jackets loud with purpose, and if this were a movie, a drone would have tracked them from above, the geometry of their movement making a pattern that a composer could score, but there was no drone and no composer, there was just the fact that life wants what it wants, and right now it wanted them on the other side of the creek. "There," she said, pointing to a spot where the current made a glassy twist that in summer would have been pretty as a ribbon and in winter meant enough depth to deceive, and Adrian nodded and moved forward and put one foot on the ice like a man trying to charm a wild thing and then another, and then he turned and reached for Eli and said, "Your mom first," and Mara would have argued if not for the fact that the men had begun picking their way down into the gully like this was a game they had played before, and she set her foot and then another and then she felt it, the give, the small complaint of crystal, and then the world did what it always does when tension outlasts its usefulness, it punished her for overestimating her luck, the ice went with a sound like a held breath breaking and the water took her legs and cold did a thing to her thoughts that made them flake and scatter, and she heard Eli cry out and she saw, in that perverse way you can see things when you are half submerged in a mountain creek in January, the boots of a man 10 yards away, and then Adrian with his city hands and his old scotch and his bad coat was there not thinking at all, or thinking only of the lever of his body, and he lay down flat to disperse his weight the way smart people do, and reached out and found the back of her coat and heaved, and his face came close enough to hers for her to see the precise color of his eyes, which was both gray and blue and something else like slate held in hand, and then he said, with calm he might not have felt, "Got you," and he did, and she came up and out with one big effort and one curse and one sob and pulled her legs up and trained, which is what happens when you have been pulling yourself out of different kinds of cold for years. Rolled and hit the bank on her side, coughing, and Eli was there and then Adrian was there too, and the men were suddenly too close and she could smell their breath, and their breath was a thing she did not want on her, and Adrian stood up between her and them because sometimes being a wall is all you can be, and the man in front said, "Mr. Hale," as if they were in a boardroom and not in a ditch in the woods, "you're making this harder than it needs to be," and Adrian said, "I know," and it was delivered like a killer joke that he refused to ruin by smiling, and the man in front smiled instead and took a step and Adrian took a step, and now they were close enough for Mara to see the line of a gun under the man's jacket, which would not be used unless